yourselves, History Students 2021. Mr. Raymond Ross, Washington High School, and I'm busy with the third topic in the series of videos. So tonight, we're going to look at the source-based question that will be question 3 in your paper 1. And this will be the question that deals with the civil rights protests in the United States of America between the period 1950s to the 1970s, and we are specifically going to concentrate on the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King. So when we look at civil rights, you need to understand a few key terminologies, and one of that would be segregation and desegregation. A lot of students get confused and they actually want to say that America desegregated, but then they are saying America segregated. Now, segregation is apartheid. It's just a nice American word for apartheid. And desegregation is the abolishing of apartheid. So, of the segregation and the apartheid laws. So, these laws, especially in the southern states of America, were known as the Jim Crow laws. Then there was a white supremacist organization called the Ku Klux Klan, and they were the people who tried to uphold white supremacy at all costs. Killing, murdering, intimidating black people at all costs. And then another word that we are going to deal with is Black Americans or Afro-Americans. It is people that are from African descent, came from Africa, and they called themselves at first Black Americans, and it later changed to Afro-Americans. We don't use the word Negro anymore. So when we talk about them, it's Afro-Americans or Black Americans. So guys, let's look at the civil rights movement. Where did it start? Now, the civil rights movement started as an innocent protest when a woman was sitting on a bus on her way from work, tired, and she refused to give up her seat to a white man. Now, the laws in America were such that if a bus started to get full from the front, black people had to move to the back. And eventually, when a white man got in, the bus was almost full. Rosa Parks was still seated, and she just refused. And this led to her arrest. And when she was arrested, Martin Luther King, who was a young Baptist preacher, about 26 years old in Alabama, he got word of it. And he then joined this protest, and it led to a year-long bus boycott. But it had the necessary outcome, because the desegregation of buses took place. Now, where did Martin Luther King get this policy of resistance? He was a huge admirer of Gandhi, who actually led the protest for freedom in India. But Gandhi believed in peaceful protest. So Martin Luther King adopted that policy of peaceful protest. So Martin Luther King was all for protest, as long as it was peaceful. So Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat, and the Montgomery bus boycott took place. It started in 1955 to 1956, about a year long, and the result was that the Supreme Court of the United States of America ruled it unconstitutional that segregated seating should be on any bus in the United States on the basis of color, and Martin Luther King emerged during this as a very, very powerful speaker and a good leader. So this led to other forms of non-violence taking place. A group of 4 students went to a restaurant, a Woolworths restaurant in Greensboro, where they asked to be served. So they went to go sit and at a counter, lunch counter, and the waiters refused. The waiters ignored these people as if they does not exist. And then they came back the next day with a bigger group. People in this restaurant got fed up. White people, obviously, and they started to throw these people with sugar as they walked out, and threw the milk over the sugar on the people's heads and so on, and laughed at them. They were humiliated, but they refused to give up this protest, and so they came back again. And this inspired, they had to desegregate the lunch counter, but then it inspired other similar actions. In the United States, if you were black, you were refused entry to sit in a library. You could go take a book, but you can't sit there and read the book inside a library. That was for whites only. So there were segregated libraries. There were segregated churches. You could go sit in the church. Segregated beaches. You couldn't go swim. And if you were black, obviously. And so this action of the students that started the sit-ins led to kneel-ins. So people of color would go into churches and go sit and pray. How do you throw somebody out of a church that's praying? They would go and have read-ins, sit in a library and read. The library says white only, and they would just go sit there and read, even though they were black. It also led to wade-ins. They would go and swim in predominantly white beaches, and this led to that these actions of them led to these places all being desegregated by law. Now, in 1961 to 1963, mass action started. The students set an example, and the adults, under the leadership of Martin Luther King, did not have a choice but to join. Yes, they started it with a bus boycott, but then it like went down, and the students came with this mass actions on beaches and hotels where they had sleep-ins and libraries, and specifically the sit-ins led to Martin Luther King and others being inspired, and Martin Luther King started mass action. Black activists in 1961 in Albania, Georgia, campaigned for desegregation, and more people joined this civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King organized mass demonstrations in Birmingham to get the downtown stores to desegregate. You see how we use the terminology, segregation, desegregation? The stores at first were very unwilling, but when police started to attack people and arrest people, business leaders in downtown America, Birmingham, realized that it's not good for business. So they asked that these prisoners be released, and it led to the desegregation of fountains and parks and even some shops, so that black people had free access to the shops. What was the federal reaction to Birmingham? Before that, Martin Luther King organized another demonstration in Birmingham where he used school children. And these school children, it would later be known as the Children's Crusade. They didn't go to school, and they came together at a Baptist church, Martin Luther King's church, from where they would walk into Birmingham. They walked in groups of 50, and they walked smack bang into the full police force of Birmingham under the leadership of Bull Connor. And he has actually asked his troops to use the high pressure hose pipes to shoot these children, and also they let loose the dogs on these people and the children. And the children were traumatized, and about 500 of them were hurt and injured in the process. And this led to a reaction from the federal government because it was all over the news. How could Kennedy justify attacking communism, verbally obviously at that stage, but in his own country there's racism? So Kennedy went onto national television, and he saw the civil rights crisis as a moral act, because he still wanted to justify what was happening. He said this is not racial, this is morally wrong. And this was his speech. He said it ought to be possible for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or color. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures, and it is as clear as the American Constitution. So without losing face by his own people, he actually sided with what was happening with regards to desegregation. It's actually a political speech that he made there. So these mass demonstrations also had a backlash. In August 28, 1963, Philip Randolph started the March for Freedom and Jobs. Now, Philip Randolph was a 74-year-old man, and people don't give him enough credit. When we hear about the March to Washington, everybody is thinking Martin Luther King, I have a dream. And people forget that it is an old man of 74 years old who made it possible for Martin Luther King to have the I have a dream speech. Because if Philip Randolph did not organize this march, Martin Luther King would not have made a speech. And this speech, march took place to the Lincoln Memorial. Now, here was 250,000 people, the biggest demonstration in civil rights history. Of the 250,000 people, it is estimated that about 60,000 were white. This thing, this whole march was non-violent. Although initially there was people were scared that it's going to turn violent, Kennedy didn't have a choice but to give permission that this march could take place, and it took place. And it was very, very well organized and non-violent. And here Martin Luther King gave his speech, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And this is probably one of the most famous speeches of all times, and people still use it and they quote it in speeches. But this wasn't the end of things. In June 1964, all the different civil rights organizations formed a coalition, and they launched the Mississippi Freedom Summer. The Southern activists joined by black and white volunteers from the North, and it didn't go down well with a lot of white people in America. And they had tactics here that says mass voter education and registration, and freedom schools, and to teach black history. Now, in June on June the 21st, 1964, 3 volunteers went missing, 2 white and 1 black, and their bodies were only found later, and they were murdered. And this led to the making of the movie Mississippi Burning. Very good movie. You can go Google it and try to get hold of it. So what was the successes of the civil rights movement? In a nutshell, they managed to, in 1964, have Kennedy introduce the Civil Rights Act to Congress. Unfortunately, Kennedy was assassinated before he could sign this to be law. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, had to sign this as a law, and yes, the Americans now had civil rights, black Americans. It also led to the 1965 Voter Rights Act. Now, why is this Voting Rights Act so important? When it was signed, on his left and on his right, the president's left and right, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were standing there for him to sign this into law, and this was a huge, huge victory for the civil rights movement. But you should remember, however, that although it was they won this legal victories to have this as laws, black people were still treated badly, and that will lead to what we're going to do in the next video, which is our essay on the Black Power movement. I thank you. Despite all the successes that we have just discussed, there is certain things that we still need to look at. And one of that was that in August 1964, an interracial group called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party attempted to challenge the legitimacy of the Mississippi all-white delegation to the Democratic Party convention. Open confrontation took place between Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, and the party. And it was here because they were denied access. And although it was a democratic convention, black people were not allowed. So it was here that Fannie Lou gave her "Is This America" speech, profound speech, turning point in American history. And she said that this was the turning point in the American civil rights movement. This was her words. We had played by the rules, done everything that we were supposed to have done. We had arrived at the doorstep and found the door slammed in our faces. And this was reiterated by John Lewis of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, that they tried everything to obey and to do what white America wanted them to do, and yet they found themselves excluded from democratic processes. This also led to the Selma Montgomery March. Now, the Selma Montgomery marches was 3 marches that took place. In March 1965, 10 years after the first bus boycott, King led a multiracial march to Montgomery, Alabama. The first attempt to this march was unsuccessful because the troops stopped them on the bridge. And they were whipped, and they were hit with batons and stuff. And this would eventually be known as Bloody Sunday. A second attempt took place, also were not successful. The president was forced to send the federal troops to tell the state troops to make way. so that this march could take place. And this eventually, in the third attempt, this march of about 70 kilometers was successful. In 1963, if we go back also, there was the bombing took place of the Baptist church, and 4 children died during this bombing, black children obviously. In 1964, we already spoke about it, I'm mentioning it again, the civil rights activists who went missing. So there were things, although they had gains, there were negatives. And when we speak about the positive gains of the civil rights movement, let's not forget that there were a lot of obstacles that in some cases were unsurmountable. And this all led to the establishment and the start of the Black Power movement. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great idea and a better idea now of the civil rights movement in the United States.